Okay, video number 4. Let's finish up community ecology, chapter 41. A lot of this information that I'm covering here are things that you did learn about in regular biology, so hopefully it's just review. However, it's also some of the material that would be super common on ecology type questions, understanding things like interactions, food type interactions, energy type interactions between different organisms within an ecosystem. All right, so trophic levels are labeled here in the middle of this diagram. You always are going to have producers at the bottom. Another name for producers are autotrophs. That means the same thing. So autotrophs are producers. All of the other trophic levels that are above it, trophic level, that would be a feeding level. All of the other feeding levels that are above it, these are all consumers, and another name for consumers is heterotrophs. Okay. So your primary producers are going to be things that are going to be able to do usually photosynthesis. The only exceptions would be things like those deep sea hydrothermal vent type communities. But in most places you're going to be dealing with things that are photosynthetic. So if we take, like in this particular example, we take some algae here. Okay, so algae, phytoplankton, those are going to be able to do photosynthesis, and then that population is consumed by the zooplankton, which would include things like Daphnia. This is a copepod. That's what plankton is in SpongeBob. Although this guy's eating plankton, he's eating phytoplankton. He's not eating Krabby Patties. And then you have, so these are basically herbivores. So then you have the carnivores that are going to be eating the zooplankton, so that's going to be the smaller fish, alewives, things like minnows, stuff like that. Carnivores that would eat those, and I'm putting the arrows the wrong way, don't get that mixed up. So the carnivores that are going to be eating those are going to be, things like bass, stuff like that. And then finally your top carnivore would be the very largest animals. In this particular one, they've got the orca there that would be eating those large fish. In a lake habitat, it might be an eagle coming in. That may be your quaternary consumer, your top carnivore there. Notice that they do have the directions here of these arrows always pointing in the direction of energy flow. So those arrows have to be passing from the food to the thing that's eating it. So Amoeba Sisters, they talk about the arrows going in the mouth of the group above it. Okay. If we put multiple of those food webs or food chains together, we can get a food web. So if you're dealing with a food web, it's just a matter of keeping track of that there's multiple interactions. Many different species don't eat just one kind of food. So in an ecosystem, you can have lots of different kinds of interactions that can get to be kind of complex. So just taking a look at this, and you should be able to think about, these types of questions here. What would happen to this leopard seal population if their competitor's population declined? So you should be able to, think about, well, if the competitor population went down, then the leopard seal population should be able to go up. But let's take a look at what food sources there would be. Would they be impacted? And things like that. Usually, and the last question that I have on here, usually on a food chain or a food web, they do not include decomposers. Decomposers are a very important part of a community, but decomposers are going to be organisms that absorb nutrients from things that are dead, any things that are dead. So ultimately, you would have to have an arrow from every single organism to your decomposers, and it just would be a lot of arrows. So a decomposer example would be something like a fungus, mold, for example, or like the fungus that produces mushrooms. Bacteria, those tend to be the main decomposers. They're not the same thing as scavengers. Scavengers are going to be things like a vulture that is going to be eating carcasses. Decomposers are not things that ingest food. They don't put it in their mouths, so they're not going to be animals. They're going to be things that absorb nutrients from things that are dead. Okay, And the last thing in chapter 41 is talking about a keystone species. All right, so the idea here is that there are some species that are so critical for the health of the environment, for the biodiversity of the whole community, that if you remove that one species, that many other species also are going to go with it, are going to die. So one example of this is the sea otter. Okay, so this is some information from some experiments that were done. There's another, the next slide is going to show you kind of a similar thing with starfish being the keystone species. So let's take a look at what's going on here. So this is the typical food chain that's going on here. Now this would be like say off the coast of California, where they have kelp forests. Okay, so this is kelp, which is a seaweed. It's a protist, but it's a very huge thing. They call them kelp forests because these are protists that are very tall, and they form stands just like in a forest. Stand of trees. Well, this is a stand of kelp that's underwater. These kelp forests, not only are they food for many organisms like snails and things like that will be creeping around in there and eating some of the kelp, but they also are home for many different kinds of things. There's lots of different species that are going to be hiding in there and living in there. That's their habitat as well. So something that can eat kelp voraciously, like crazy amount of kelp, are these guys. These are sea urchins. Sea urchins can absolutely decimate a kelp forest. Kind of think like clear-cutting forests can, like with humans. So if you have enough sea otters around, sea otters like to eat the urchins. So if you have enough sea otters around, they keep that urchin population down. And if you can keep the urchin population low enough, then your kelp forest does just fine. Then the kelp is just fine, no problem. But what ended up happening, and this was something that took some studying in order to figure out what was going on, but eventually some scientists, they figured out that there were some populations of orcas that normally didn't eat otters. Now that wasn't a normal thing. However, the seal population, what that is their typical food, the seal population was doing very poorly. And so the otters started to eat, or sorry, the orcas started to eat otters. So you can see now there's fewer otters over here, so your otter population went down. And if the otter population goes down, then that means that they're not eating as many urchins. So your urchin population is going to increase. And if you have lots of urchins around, those urchins they're eating kelp like crazy, and the kelp population goes down. And without the kelp population there, you don't have habitat for many different species, and the overall ecosystem changed dramatically because of that. So that's an example. The otters are an example of a keystone species. They're an organism that is so critical for the health of a community that if you remove it, many changes happen to the community, not just the loss of a single species. And so we do have to be careful with things like endangered species, because some of those species, if you lose them, it's not just losing one. It can have very vast, drastic changes on the ecosystem just in general. I've seen other videos about wolves in Yellowstone being keystone species and having a far-reaching impact. And then, as I mentioned, the starfish did a very similar thing because starfish are also another predator on sea urchins. So this was an experiment that was done that kind of showed the same thing. When you move the starfish from the community, then you ended up with a loss of habitat. And they said the mussels eventually took over and eliminated the algae that was needed for the other invertebrates. So that's an example of a keystone species. Okay, so that takes us to the end of chapter 41. Another video for ecosystem ecology coming soon.